Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Eric Hauge. I'm the Executive Director at Homeline. Hopefully you can hear me. And you're joining us on Wednesday, October 6th for another one of Homeline's Eviction Moratorium Phase-Out webinars. Today, we're going to be joined by both Homeline's COVID-19 Eviction Response Coordinator, Housing Attorney Rachel Sterling, for another overview of the current eviction moratorium phase-out situation in Minnesota. We have a handful of questions that have been submitted too, and so we'll get to questions as well later. But then after the overview, we're going to be joined by Dan Hylton, the research manager at HousingLink, for a detailed overview of research and analysis and data that HousingLink has on rental market trends during the pandemic, during the eviction moratorium. So we're glad to have Dan join us today. I think he was on a session last year, September, around this time. Okay, so before we get started, really quickly, just a couple pieces of information. Again, a little intro about Homeline. We're a statewide nonprofit organization, advise renters over the phone or via email in English, Spanish, Somali, and Hmong languages. And you can contact us at our number or our website there, or the specific language lines. Again, on these seminars, we do provide kind of general legal information. If you're a renter in Minnesota, please do contact our hotline directly for individualized assistance information about your situation. We also have materials on our website about the phase out and previous recordings of these seminars. And we are going to continue these webinars, not quite as frequently as we have been every week, but here's the upcoming schedule, and we will be scheduling more sessions into November and December. So we'll have Dan on today from HousingLink. Next week, we are going to be, again, covering the new phase-out change, which happens next Tuesday. We'll talk about that a little bit today as well, but we'll also have Housing and Stability Attorney Mac Tsai from the Housing Justice Center, who is going to be talking a little bit about some of the issues renters are experiencing with Rent Help MN, answering some questions as well. We're working on scheduling a seminar at the end of the month with some speakers about the rent control and rent stabilization ballot measures. And then we'll be hosting a couple more sessions in November and December about a number of other topics, including bringing back some folks from rental assistance programs and legal aid attorneys to highlight what's going on later this year on that front. So again, you can always take a look at the upcoming schedule on our website there, and I'll put the links in the chat. And then, as usual, we just want to remind folks about the rental assistance programs, statewide tenant-initiated program, renthelpmn.org, or dialing 211 gets you there. And then the Zero Balance Project in Dakota, Ramsey, and Hennepin counties, landlord-initiated program. And then lastly, the Ramsey County specific rent assistance program, which we understand is a slightly quicker process for residents who are in Ramsey County. So take a look at that if you need rental assistance. So with that, what we're going to do quick is I'm going to hand it over to Rachel so that she can go through our overview. And we have a few updates this week over previous weeks, and kind of highlighting what's going to be happening next Tuesday. So we do have a handful of questions that were submitted in advance that are very legal focused. We're going to wait till after Rachel and then Dan does his presentation to jump to questions. So, but if you do have any questions for Rachel or Dan, please, we prefer if you can send them over the Q&A system in Zoom so we can keep track of them. So with that, I'll hand it over to Rachel. Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, Eric. Hello, all. So as Eric said, I will do a quick overview. We have been kind of going over this several weeks in basically since the end of June when this was starting up. So if you need a more in-depth version of that, I would recommend going to go to one of the webinars, the earlier ones, especially where we were going pretty detailed into this. Those of you who have been around a while may notice that I am not Mike Farah. He is off this week, so get a little bit of a change up. And then we will again be going over more details next week as to exactly what's happening with what we'll call phase 5, which will make more sense in a second if you have no idea what I'm talking about. So to start off with though, Minnesota eviction. So during the governor's peacetime emergency, for the majority of it, there was a eviction moratorium in place that started in March of 2020 and went through the end of June 2021. So quite a ways. And so the eviction moratorium was replaced by the temporary session law that we're currently under on June 30th, 2021. That was the effective date. And this has been called the eviction moratorium phase out. It was part of the omnibus housing omnibus bill that the legislature passed this past spring. So what that's really doing is effectively taking the limitations that were made in with the executive order 2079 was the one that was around the longest, and is slowly phasing out those limitations and kind of allowing back in the legal options that landlords had before the peacetime emergency took effect. So if we go to the next slide, you will see a timeline, a nice visualization of what was effective when. Currently, so we're in phase 5, which again, we'll show in a nice visual way in a moment. But really what that means is that starting on June 30th, phase 1 went into effect. That allowed a lot of things to happen. It kept the options for evictions and lease terminations that had been the exceptions to the executive orders that were in place during the peacetime emergency under Executive Order 2079, but it also added a couple of options for landlords to terminate or not renew a lease for material lease violations, and to file evictions for those tenants who were behind on rent but were either refusing to apply or refusing to cooperate or provide proof that they were applying with the COVID-19 emergency rental assistance programs. So that was what happened the day of enactment. Phase 2 started a couple weeks later, basically just meant that landlords could then start filing evictions for material lease violations, as long as it wasn't non-payment. You'll notice throughout this that non-payment is usually still a protected area. That is because, at least what we believe it to be, is because the emergency rental assistance programs were available, but we're still processing applications, and it was taking longer than anyone was expecting to take. And so the legislature was trying to keep in protections in place for those tenants who had applied, but through probably no fault of their own, just were hanging out waiting for rent help to process and get their money into the hands of the landlords. So then phase 2 started on July 14th. Phase 3 began on August 13th, and that added a new option for landlords to terminate or not renew leases for those tenants who were behind on rent but were ineligible for COVID-19 emergency rental assistance. And so we talked about that when that was coming into effect as to what ineligible actually meant. We've got a slide a little later on that kind of goes more into that detail to the best of what we understand it to be. So that's been in place, a month and a half now. And so that was phase 3. Phase 4 is just allowing landlords to evict for that same reason that they were allowed to terminate or not renew the month before. And so that's the phase we're currently in. That started on September 12th. And then finally on October 12th, next Tuesday, phase 5 will happen. And on that day is when most of the off-ramp protections end. And so what that means is that a landlord can end a lease for any legal reason, so long as the appropriate notice under the lease is given. Landlords can also file evictions for any legal reason except for non-payment of rent for those tenants who have pending COVID-19 emergency rental assistance applications in place. So those protections are the only lingering protections that happen after October 12th that are still in play. And those protections continue on and through what we termed phase 6, which is June 1st of 2022. So next June. On June 1st, the protections for tenants that have pending COVID-19 eviction response, or excuse me, COVID-19 emergency rental assistance applications, go away at that point. So quite a bit of time between now and then, but again, with the way that the application process has slowed, at least at the very beginning of this, when this was passed, it seemed good idea to have it extend out as long as it does. If things are still backed up and still going, the legislature will have the opportunity to kind of, I guess, reassess next session. But at this point, this is where the protections extend on to. So again, right now we are in phase 4. Starting next Tuesday, I will make this little blue greeny box extend out to phase 5. And that will basically be kind of the end of most of the limitations set on landlords. So at least by the executive orders that were in place during the peacetime emergency. Again, except for those lingering protections for tenants who have pending applications, can't be evicted for non-payment of rent. So what does a pending application mean? We'll get more into this next week as well when Max Tsai is talking. But basically what Minnesota Housing has told us is that it's an application that has been submitted and has not been denied, withdrawn, or paid. So an incomplete status is not the same as pending. So you have to hit the submit button for it to go from incomplete to pending. If a payment is deemed ineligible, that status is going to be updated in the system, and the tenant will get some sort of written denial notice with the reasons sent to the tenant. Either, my understanding is mostly via email, since that's how most of the communications, at least with Rent Help MN, work. The tenants may be able to reapply or appeal, and if they are appealing, then the application is going to be considered pending again. So that is all some very definitive definitions and some very vague definitions given to us by Minnesota Housing, at least when it comes to what is a pending application. In the next slide, we talk about income eligibility. Again, that was the phase that we're currently in right now. It deals heavily with whether a tenant who's behind on rent is eligible for the rental assistance or not. In general, the income eligibility requirements that are laid out on the Rent Help MN's website, and these come from Treasury guidelines, is that the applicant needs to be within 80% or below of the area median income that is determined by county. So for example, the metro area counties, that is up to $79,900 income for a family of 4 is the 80% of the area median income. Lower in AMIs are going to be found in less densely populated counties. So example, 59,600 is the lowest for family 4 that is currently listed. So those are the highest and the lowest, and those most counties in Minnesota have levels somewhere between those two, obviously. But that is going to be the kind of the number one thing to look at for ineligibility is the income requirements. There's other options, or excuse me, other eligibility requirements that are listed on Rent Help MN, but that's the kind of the cut and dry one. So then on the next slide, we talk about the continuing safe harbor for tenants who are applying for rental assistance. That what I was talking about, the protections that last through June 1st of 2022. I do feel like, we keep saying this over and over again, but it's really important to understand that even though starting next week, a lot of the protection, most of the protections, not even a lot, just most of the protections go away, this one still remains. And so it is still something that if a tenant is behind on rent, the tenant should apply for rent help MN, because this will afford them the protection from this session law for not being able to be evicted for non-payment of rent. I would like to say for any tenants that are listening, if your landlord is filing an eviction against you, it is really, really, really important to show up to the initial hearing date that is listed on your summons, because if you don't show up, even if you have a pending application, it gets messy because you can't, you basically, the judge is like, oh, you're in default, and it's harder to not find in favor of the landlord. So it's super, super important that even if you have a pending application, that you show up to your hearing date if you do an eviction filed, and you tell your landlord that you have a pending application. So those are the two pieces of advice that I have to tenants regarding this continuing protection, is that it exists. You should take advantage of it if you're behind on rent, but you do still need to, it's not an automatic slam dunk. You still need to exert the fact that you have this protection in place. All right. So then a couple other things that are part of this session law. The also includes a notice requirement. Again, this lasts until October 12th, so next week. If a landlord is going to try and evict for non-payment of rent before next week, they must give a 15-day notice. That is going to be a little difficult at the moment if you are planning on filing an eviction on October 12th, but have not given the notice yet, because you will still, right now, you still need to give a notice. So if you've missed the deadline, if you had plans of going out and filing on October 12th, to give that notice. So if you gave a notice today, you'd still be obligated to wait until the 15 days has passed to file. But because right now that is still what the law requires. And what the notice has to state is that the eviction moratorium is ended and that the tenant can be evicted, the total amount of rent due, and the information about where to get rental assistance. That's going to be specifically Rent Help MN and 211. There are other rental assistance programs out there, but those are the ones that are required under the session law. It also, I would like to point out, says you only need to put the total amount of rent due. I would argue that there are other things that sometimes come along that end up on a tenant's ledger, such as late fees or parking fees or something like that, that would be in a landlord's best interest to include on any sort of notice, because even though you would think that it would be obvious as to how much, a tenant should know how much they owe, they don't always know. We get calls every day about tenants who know that they're behind on rent, but they don't know how much, or they don't know how much the fees are, or they don't know. So it's in everyone's best interest just to be very clear about the total amount that the landlord says is due, whether it's just rent or other things included as well. If the landlord doesn't give this notice, the court has discretion on staying the eviction if the notice wasn't sufficient, and it's under a substantial compliance standard instead of a strict compliance standard. So there is some wiggle room in this, but basically if just no notice is given, that doesn't even rise to substantial compliance. It's just non-compliance. So it is important that, to know that this requirement is still in place and will be in place until next Tuesday. Now, there are other notice requirements that exist outside of this session law that we wanted to touch on, because these are relatively new. And so these exist in addition right now to the session law notice requirement and will continue to exist after next week. And so if you are in a landlord in St. Louis Park or in Minneapolis, these two cities have enacted their own notice requirements that continue on. So in St. Louis Park, you have to give at least a 7 days notice before bringing an eviction action for non-payment, and it has to be in writing. And that is a link to the city code that explains it there. Minneapolis has basically the same requirements, except that it's a 14-day notice before the eviction can be filed for non-payment of rent. And that notice also has to be in writing. And that is ordinance 244.2060. So it's relatively new. So yeah, so right now, if you were giving a 15-day notice in compliance with the COVID-19, the off-ramp language, that 15-day notice is longer than both of these, obviously. So as long as you include all the information that's necessary in both of those notice requirements, then you are most likely complying. You don't have to give what Referee Hoteling was saying from the 4th District last week, is that, at least in her opinion, as long as you're hitting all of the bullet points for all the notice requirements, then you probably are going to be okay with only giving one notice instead of giving like 2 separate notices in these cities. Additionally, the CARES Act also has a lingering notice requirement of its own. So while the CARES Act was expired I shouldn't even say last July of 2020, that 30-day notice that was included in the CARES Act never sunsetted. And so if you are in a CARES Act covered property, which has a long list of definitions under the CARES Act, but it's most of the buildings that have some sort of federal subsidy, anything covered under the Violence Against Women's Act, as well as any properties that have a federally backed mortgage, so like Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. Those are all covered under the CARES Act, and so need to comply with this 30-day notice as well. So again, if you that isn't going away after next week either. And so, if you're in St. Louis Park and Minneapolis, you have these non-payment requirements. If you're under a CARES Act property, you have this 30-day requirement that, again, if you make sure that you check all your boxes for both of those requirements, so timelines, writing, what needs to be included, then you should be good with only giving the one notice, is what we've been told. And that makes sense to me as well. Just as long as you are getting getting all your ducks in a row. Eric just posted some CARES Act resources. If you're a landlord or a tenant and just have utterly no idea whether you're in a CARES Act covered rental or not, goodness knows I wouldn't know off the top of my head. So it's pretty reasonable to not know. In general, there are some resources to try and figure out if you are or not. So, but that is the long list of notice requirements. And so that is the end of my little spiel. So I would like to introduce Dan. Eric, if you have the deets on Dan.
Yes, well, welcome, Dan. Dan Hylton is a research manager at HousingLink. And so we had Dan on, I want to say it was in September or something last year. Right. And it was a very fascinating presentation about what was going on in the rental market during the pandemic. And now we have another whole year of data, or more than a year of data. So again, we did get a few questions submitted. Most of them are legal related, so we'll hold those to the end. Dan's got a good presentation here, and hopefully there's some questions for Dan as well. So yeah, we'll just pass it over to you, Dan.
Great. Thanks, Eric. I'm Dan Hylton. I'm research manager with HousingLink. HousingLink is a Minneapolis-based nonprofit with a mission of improving people's lives through information, expanding their affordable rental choices. The vast majority of people who interact with HousingLink do so through resources we provide for low to moderate income renters and case managers who serve them. We get about 30 to 40,000 visitors a month to our website, where we have a housing search tool with affordable rental vacancies, as well as waiting list openings for subsidized housing. And we have a bunch of resources like housing tips, training videos, and so on that help folks navigate the very complex world of affordable housing. And that's how the majority of folks know us. But we're also engaged in research on rental housing market trends and supply. And a lot of our work is driven by two proprietary data sets. Next slide. Our streams database is a publicly accessible database of all rental properties and units in the state of Minnesota that are contractually obligated to a level of affordability. So you can search by a number of parameters related to funding source, affordability, expiration date, location, and so on, and then click through to see details on individual properties, or even export the results of your search to a CSV. And I'll mention that in the next couple weeks, we are going to be doing our annual update of this resource. So on the chance that you're someone that uses this to locate affordable rental in a geography, you'll see some new data up there in the next couple of weeks. And that will be for all projects that have financing through calendar year 2020. Next slide. And the other flagship data set from HousingLink is our rental review data. So for about a decade, HousingLink has published our quarterly Twin Cities rental review report with year-over-year figures on rent by number of bedrooms and building type, which is like multifamily apartments versus the shadow market of single family, duplex, condo, and townhome rentals. Our data is somewhat unique in the industry in that a lot of data out there is based on surveys of occupied units, but those surveys are usually going through large management companies, and they don't really provide insight into what's going on in this shadow market. As you can see in this report right here, if it's not too small, in the lower left part where there's the blue bars, you see that apartments make up 82% of vacancies that we're seeing. So that shadow market is only about 18%. And that's down from recent years. And I'll talk about that more in a little bit. But for now, I'll say it is a minority of openings, but we think it's important to include a shadow market property, say like a single family or duplex rental, is a lot more likely to be a mom and pop type operation. And many landlords of that type are a little more able to work with a renter's unique and sometimes more challenging circumstances. So I would say like in submarkets, Eric, do you still live in my neighborhood of North Minneapolis?
I sure do.
All right. So up in the north side. In some markets like where we live, there's just not a ton of multifamily stock. So it can be like a single family or duplex can be the only opportunity a family has to live, say, in their child's school district or close to an employer. And we just think it's important to reflect that entire scope of options that are out there for renters in the data we use for research. And there's actually one other thing I should mention, which is that where a lot of information on rent trends comes from surveys of occupied units, our data comes directly from publicly advertised rental listings. So if there's a unit that's been occupied for a number of years, whether the rent's going up or staying the same, we're not going to pick that up, but we are going to capture it when the renter moves out and the landlord makes a decision on what to list it at. So we tend to be really responsive to changes in the market because we're picking up rents for units that are turned over, which is when landlords are most easily able to set new rent amounts. We also capture a lot of new construction and new units hitting the market. What we like to say is that when we're reporting on rents, we're reflecting literally what a renter is seeing in the open market. So we've published this Twin Cities rental review report for almost a decade with quarterly year-over-year updates by submarket. But at the beginning of 2018, we decided to dive a little deeper into Minneapolis and St. Paul, where our sample sizes are a little larger, and we began publishing our rental housing briefs. Next slide. So in these reports, which again are just for Minneapolis and St. Paul, we're producing a new report each month. We're looking at year-over-year trends and beginning to dig a little deeper beyond just like rent amounts and bedroom sizes and saying, what does that translate to in terms of affordability? So looking at the percent of units that are affordable to families at varying levels of income, or giving the total number of listings we saw for a given month that say advertised a willingness to accept Section 8 vouchers, as well as a few other metrics from our data. Next slide. And then last year, we began publishing a Tableau visualization looking at some of the primary metrics from those rental housing brief reports, but this is for the entire metro. So the original idea was to sort of have a before the COVID pandemic, and then like how have things been impacted, and then eventually sort of like after the crisis, but the before and after is extended to far beyond 12 months. So we ended up just deciding maybe there was value in tracking. We dropped the COVID term and just decided to have this become Twin Cities rental housing trends, where we're following a rolling 12 months on a number of metrics. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is drawn from some combination of these last few resources I've been showing you. So sorry for that long introduction, but next slide. So the state of things. Eric is right. I presented as part of this series right around a year ago. And I think part of my message I was conveying at that time was how it felt like we were in sort of a waiting period. Rents, which had been steadily rising since the end of the Great Recession, were just starting to stabilize heading into 2020. And then COVID exploded. Next slide. So this is coming out of our rental review data. Here you see first quarter median multifamily rents in the Twin Cities. So year over year, first quarter from 2012 to 2020. So that's right from the end of the Great Recession. And since we're talking first quarter rents here, the end of this graph is right before COVID shut everything down. It would have ended that quarter in March of 2020. So things were kind of like, for some reason, March 23 is stuck in my head. But for a little lull there in 2015 and 2016 that you see, we saw a pretty steady climb in rents until the very end of that graph. And then a number of factors came into play related to the pandemic that, as I said, seemed to hold the rental market almost in stasis. Next slide. So the rental market by all rights should not have been in stasis. The impact of COVID on the economic situation of renters was immediate and dramatic on a number of fronts. Next slide. So if you remember back to the end of March and the beginning of April 2020, it really felt like a very broad economic crisis all around. There was a tremendous amount of job loss, and nobody really knew how everything was going to play out. And a number of government interventions designed to assist renters were either far in the future or they were still on the drawing board. But as you're all aware, because like every webinars in this series is talking about it, Minnesota acted quickly in passing an eviction moratorium, which more than a year later, as we know all about, is only in the process of being phased out. And I'm not going to talk about any details about the phase out because that's the one thing I'm not equipped to talk about here relative to other people who are present. But I just say that between when it went into effect and now, any renters who've fallen through the cracks in terms of rental assistance and income assistance and are behind on rent have been protected by a moratorium that is stronger than any federal moratorium that we've seen. But that said, just because you're protected by an eviction moratorium doesn't mean that you don't still need to pay your rent. And the need for income assistance and rental assistance has been very high. Next slide. According to the Urban Institute, 87,502 low-income jobs were lost as of September 4 of 2020 due to the coronavirus economic recession. And you don't need me to tell you, but we know that those were jobs in hospitality, food service, healthcare, frontline workers, retail. And you also don't need me to tell you, but the statistic is at the bottom of this slide where you can see that a higher percentage of renters are low income than homeowners. So it ends up being an explosive combination with regard to job loss among rental households. Next slide. This is kind of a sideline, but it's a really extreme stat from a poll we conducted last June. And June was kind of where just everything was, I think, the craziest, because it was before assistance and stimulus checks started coming in and everything. And there was so much uncertainty, but surveying mostly low income renters, 70% of them we surveyed in June 2020 said that they had either lost their job or had reduced hours as a result of the pandemic, which is crazy. Next slide. So all the pieces were set for an absolute catastrophe of late rent payments. And though the eviction moratorium was in place, we've obviously known all along that that's just prolonging the inevitable unless something changes. But that was, in fact, when a whole series of public policy interventions began. Next slide. So by the time we were in midsummer, most, not all, most folks had their federal stimulus checks, if you remember round one. And most who lost their jobs were eligible for both federal unemployment and as well as a boost at the state level. Next slide. And almost certainly, largely as a result of these interventions, most renters were actually paying their rent on time as of the end of summer in 2020. The Minnesota Multi-Housing Association was collecting rent payment information on about 30,000 units in 3 apartment classes throughout most of the pandemic. Class C units are those that are most likely to be occupied by lower income folks. And you can see that they're not quite as current as those in Class A and Class B, which it makes sense. The rents in those units are lower, but those living in them are more vulnerable to being a victim of economic turmoil. But even so, classes here on all 3 classes were only down a couple percentage points from the previous year. And they're all over 90%. Are paying on time, which would seem to indicate some level of success on the part of government assistance to that point. Next slide. It's always worthwhile to note in any public policy intervention that there's some people, often the people who could benefit most, who for one reason or another, whether it's a disconnect in outreach or a lack of available documentation or other barriers, who don't benefit or for whom assistance is not enough. And so even with these interventions, there's some that are still behind on rent. Next slide. Beginning last fall, the state and some partner organizations were able to organize a series of renter assistance programs. The COVID Housing Assistance Program, or CHAP, which came out of round 1 stimulus funding in the fall of 2020. Next slide. Rent Help MN, which came out of round 2 stimulus funding, and I know which is being talked about extensively here and is still at work. And next slide. And the Zero Balance Project, which is Hennepin County, Ramsey County, and Dakota County, attempting to reach as yet unreached renters late on their rents by giving landlords the opportunity to begin an application and then reach out to renters to submit the application. And then I noted at the beginning of this presentation, the Ramsey County St. Paul program is also present, but I don't have a slide indicating that. And there may be, I know there's smaller local programs that I'm not covering here. But broadly, that's the government interventions that were happening. And now we'll look at what was and is happening in the broader economy. Next slide. So unemployment. So remember, we were talking about June of 2020 being this crazy moment. And here you see there's a very alarming trend at the moment from spring into summer of 2020. And since then, it's really come back down. This past summer, unemployment was down pretty much near what the figures were going into the pandemic, which is actually pretty surprising. You hear a lot, particularly in the hospitality and restaurant industries, about short staffing and not being able to find enough workers. So about that, you know, or you may know, sorry, the traditional measure of unemployment only captures those folks who are not working but have actively looked for work in the past 4 weeks. Well, the US Bureau of Labor Statistics adds in a few alternate measures of unemployment, including those who've not looked for work in the past 4 weeks because they don't think it's possible. They no longer think it's possible to find a job, which they call discouraged workers, as well as those they refer to marginally attached, which is a newer category, which refers to potential workers who have stopped looking for work in the past 12 months for reasons other than discouragement. But both of those represent a contingent of unemployed that are not being picked up in the standard measure, but which reflect a portion of the population not earning an income. Next slide. Also, in terms of an impact on rent payments, it's really worth noting that even if the overall unemployment numbers are down, the number of long-term unemployed is up pretty significantly. The median weeks that people have been unemployed and the total number that qualify as long-term unemployed. Next slide. So if we roll this all together into a broad view of what's been impacting rent payments, I think it's this. We discussed a number of government interventions, so stimulus checks, unemployment assistance, rent assistance, and then the traditional unemployment rate going down. But on the other side, you have those non-traditional measures of unemployment. So where people are not working, but are not getting picked up in the traditional measure because they've either stopped, because they've stopped looking for work. And in the traditional measure of unemployment, there is a fairly significant growth in long-term unemployment. And then you also have to think about people who may have gotten a job, but they were already so far behind on rent that they can't catch up, even though they have an income. And then, of course, it's not only rent that people fall behind on when they can't make their rent payment. There's credit card bills, phone bills, car payments, et cetera. And trying to get back above water and all of that can contribute to difficulty paying rent going forward. And then you consider those folks who aren't in the system. So MIND, the Department of Employment and Economic Development, I think is what it is, the state agency, is only tracking those people who filed for unemployment. So the same way that there's a certain population that's not eligible for or somehow does not end up with a stimulus check, you have some folks who never entered the unemployment rolls, probably some of the same folks who also did not end up qualifying or getting rent assistance, but those folks may also have lost an income and are behind on their rent. Next slide. And when you look at how that all comes out in the wash, so this is that on-time rent payment survey from the Minnesota Multi-Housing Association. On the left, you're seeing the bars that we saw before, the orange, which is rent payments as of August 2020. And on the right, we're seeing August 2021. And, you know, I mentioned that August 2020 was across the board a couple percentage points lower in on-time rent payments than the previous year. Well, here you see them ticking down 1% or 2% more in all three apartment classes. So it's not a catastrophic drop, but next slide, you extend this over all the rental units in the state, and it's not small. This is a very rough estimate. So we're figuring 610,000 rental units in the state and sort of an average of 6% late on rent payments for all three bedroom classes. And you get around 35,000 late rent payments as of the end of August. Next slide. It's now about eviction. So I know that's talked about a lot here. I'll just show a couple things. We know that late rent obviously often kicks off, well, usually kicks off the eviction process. And here we see what happened in Minnesota to this point. the moratorium really stoppered things up over the past couple of years. And we know the eviction moratorium off-ramp obviously is just about to conclude. And I guess we have a lot of uncertainty right now as to how many of those 35,000-ish late rent payments are going to end up with an eviction filing. That was in August. So a number of those people could have been moved along in the process, could have gotten a check in the meantime. And obviously, as we've been hearing, if they can document, I'm in the process of having my application reviewed, that they have submitted, that they are still protected. And Eric and Rachel jump in if I say anything about the eviction protections that is wrong. Next slide. Here we see a graph of eviction filings. Now this is filings, not actual evictions. But you can see that they kicked back in as of the first couple phases of the off-ramp in midsummer. So if renters, again, can't show that they at least try to apply for assistance or are deemed ineligible as the phases have been implemented, then landlords can begin an eviction process. But as of the time I pulled this, you see that there was a sudden rush midsummer, but maybe it's crested and is dropping off a bit. But we're going to have to see it play out over a longer period of time to know ultimately where this ends up. Next slide. Oh, I should mention that last graph was from the Princeton Eviction Lab. There's a link there at the bottom, but if you just typed in Eviction Lab, I think you'll get it. But they a couple of years ago made kind of big news with tracking nationwide evictions, but the data was really behind. There was like a couple year lag or something. And I was surprised to find how current and granular the data is. So I don't know how they're sourcing all of it state by state, but there's some really good information there. So sorry about that. Next slide. Okay, so here we see, and I pulled this on Monday. There's been over 47,000 applications submitted to Rent Help MN and a little under 21,000 payments made. So we were talking about the 35,000 late rent payments, and some of those have maybe been helped since, and we're trying to figure out sort of a gap between applications and payments made. And I want to be very clear that I'm not suggesting that there's a perfect overlap between late rent payments and people who are tied up in the system right now, because that would end up proving to be wildly inaccurate. But there is some overlap, and I guess there's some hope that as applications continue to get processed and money gets out the door, that even after the off-ramp finishes, that maybe we can avoid some of the worst case scenarios in terms of the pent-up evictions. But the process is certainly not going as fast or smoothly as was hoped, and for sure there's still a lot of uncertainty. But that's pretty much what we know about the payment of rent, where we're at, and sort of what it might portend. And now we're going to turn to some figures that HousingLink's data can tell us about the market. Next slide. So first, I'll recall that median rent graph from earlier. Do you remember how we saw that little dip heading into 2020? Well, here I extended it into 2021, so first quarter 2021, and you see that the dip continues, or at least for 2-bedroom rentals, it continues. For 1-bedrooms were remaining stable, and they're still down from where they were when they peaked in 2019. And so that would seem to be an indication that we're seeing the market loosening up a bit over that 2-year period. Next slide. But now let's zoom in on just what's happened from the beginning of this year. So these figures come from our Twin Cities Rental Housing Trends Report, which there's a link at the bottom or the URL at the bottom of the screen. But I added for this visual some trend lines just so you can see for each of the 3-bedroom sizes, it's ticking back up. It's headed back up in 2021. Not dramatically so, but for all 3-bedroom classes. So we had this potential softening of the market heading into the pandemic, but the rent figures that we have are no longer showing that. Let's look at a couple of additional indicators that are highly related to rent amounts. Next slide. So one of the things that tends to follow any softening or tightening of the market is searches for affordable housing, or should say searches for any housing. But if you go to HousingLink, you're looking for affordable housing. So when rents plateau or lower just a bit, people don't have to work as hard to find a place to live. And we see this reflected in this graph of searches on HousingLink's search tool. Quarterly searches, which usually year over year are pretty consistent over time. They dipped 25% from 2019 to 2020. So right about that time, we were seeing a dip in rents. And then you see they were starting to climb again a bit there at the beginning of 2021. Next slide. And then similar to rents, when we zoom in more granularly, just on the most recent series of quarters, we can see searches which had that little dip ticking back up 2 quarters in a row. So people spending a little more time in their housing search as apartment options are maybe a little less available. And our apartments a little less available. Let's look at rental listings hitting our search service. Next slide. So some of our, this is kind of a disclaimer about the little numbers you see atop each bar here. We have more listings than that on our website, but some of the listings are available from property management companies where we get a data feed, but who's changing that information, how those feeds are working can be a little, it can change over time. So the only really consistent measure we have for change in supply is kind of a proxy that we get from looking at actual landlords who go in and personally manage their listings on our site. So that's what this graph is. And similar to when we looked at searches, we're looking first at the run up to the pandemic. So year over year, Q1 through Q1 of this year. And wow, in this graph, you're seeing how we came out of that really tight market of the 2000 teens with available listings just spiking. Not quite, but nearly 3 times the number available in Q1 of 2021 as compared to the same quarter 3 years prior. Next slide. But similar to with searches, when you break this out to a more granular view, you see how things actually peaked around the turn of the year. And like these other measures ticked down by just a bit in Q2, suggesting things may be tightening a bit. So much about understanding what's going on in the market is really about triangulating different indicators that are each telling a part of the story. And if you can get those indicators working in concert and seeming to tell the same message, you can feel a little bit better about asserting things. You know, we saw searches for housing, which had been declining year over year, suddenly start to tick back up as we got into 2021, which suggests a little more demand. And rental listings had been growing year over year, but now go down in the most recent quarters, which is literally less supply. We should see the metro vacancy rate tracking similarly. Next slide. So a vacancy rate of 5% is typically used as a balanced market rule of thumb in the housing world. But that tight market of the 2000 teens I referred to, that had an extended stretch of a vacancy rate at like 3% or even below, like for a decade in the Twin Cities. But as you can see in this chart here, around this time last year, we were seeing those vacancy rates creeping up and almost hitting that 5% mark. And then as with searches and rent amounts, we see it swing a bit there as we head into 2021. Next slide. This is maybe a good time to mention that a metropolitan area is not a monolith. So submarkets can and do often behave pretty independently, depending on local factors at work. So even while we talk about the Twin Cities vacancy rate never passing 5%, look where we were in Q2 with downtown Minneapolis and downtown St. Paul. 9.6% vacancy rate for downtown St. Paul and 7.2 for downtown Minneapolis. And I think an obvious question for anyone seeing those figures might be about whether this is due to concerns over like social unrest and crime, like our renters being scared away from urban living. And I'll say that in spite of what the vacancy rates might seem to suggest here, I don't think that's really what's going on. In that extended period of low vacancy rate and rising rents, there was a lot of multifamily development happening in Minneapolis and St. Paul, particularly in the downtown. So the supply was just ramping up. And a lot of that was being driven by downtown Minneapolis, downtown St. Paul, where, by the way, a lot of developments remain in the pipeline, even as many aspects of the market went into that sort of stasis we were talking about. And I see a question in about downtown rents very expensive. They tend to be more expensive, and I'm actually going to talk about why that is here in a couple of minutes. So I'll keep plugging along. Next slide. Here you see a reference in a Star Tribune article from last month. A quarter of all apartments leased in the past 18 months in the Twin Cities were in Minneapolis. So there just happens to be a lot of supply there right now relative to the rest of the metro. And it appears that though there was some uncertainty for a bit in late 2020, people do still want to live there. The higher vacancy rates in Minneapolis and St. Paul really seems like it has more to do with it being one part of the metro where the development world was able to dig themselves out of the hole that we were in housing production coming out of the Great Recession. Next slide. But even where we see a larger number of units hitting the market and a higher vacancy rate, I want to say something about what this all means in terms of a family that's actually looking for an affordable place to live. So just because we have a greater number of vacancies hitting the market doesn't necessarily mean that we're seeing a greater number of affordable rents. So the vacancy rate for affordable rental doesn't necessarily follow the overall vacancy rate. When somebody gets a good deal, they tend to hang on to that unit. And newly constructed units are kind of necessarily hitting the listing services, right? That a new property opens up and they advertise the units, which just follows. And a lot of new apartment construction in recent years was more on the luxury end of things, which kind of answers a question about downtown rent. So if there's a lot of units hitting the market, a lot of newer units being developed in and around the downtowns, a lot of those tend to be luxury units. So yeah, they do tend to be a little more expensive. Those in housing circles know the term NOAH, or naturally occurring affordable housing. So housing is typically naturally affordable because it's older or lacking amenities or in a sub-market that just doesn't support higher rents. Basically, nobody's out there building new NOAH units. New units that are affordable are almost certainly getting some type of public financing or assistance. So take downtown Minneapolis. Late last year, things got about as close to saturated as we've seen in a long time, and supply was able to absorb a lot of that persistent demand. But if a lot of those units are upscale, then that supply ends up being pretty invisible to lower income folks. I'm going to try and illustrate that with a graphic from one of our reports. So everything we've been talking about thus far suggests that there was a softening in the market that occurred in late 20 and early 2021, right? And that it was even more pronounced in Minneapolis. Next slide. We track a measure in our Minneapolis and St. Paul rental housing briefs where we look at the percentage of all vacancies that are affordable to varying levels of income. Housing industry acronym AMI, most of you probably know it, just refers to the area median income. And what this chart is showing you is that of all the vacancies we came across in our data in December of 2020, 95% of them were affordable to families making 100% of the area median. So that's the lower left pie graph. This year, it's a little over 72,000 for an individual for the metro area, 103,000 for a family of 4. So if you're making that amount, hey, 95% of all vacancies are affordable to you. And that right column was same month, December, a year ago, when the market was a little tighter, and you can see slightly fewer units affordable at that amount. And you see that pretty much for all the income levels from 50% of area median up to 100% of area median. The decrease in rents we were seeing, driven by a slightly higher vacancy rate, had a real world impact on what renters at those income levels were seeing in the open market. But what a lot of people notice when they look at these figures is right at the top. There's pretty much nothing that can happen in the private market that's going to directly increase housing options for that lowest income tier of renters, those making 30% of area median. You know, higher vacancy rate, moderating rents, they're still not going to be affordable to people in that bracket. That's a family of 4 making around $31,000 a year, by the way, which incidentally is right around $15 an hour working full time. That's the amount some communities are trying to raise the minimum wage to, which is getting a little afield from the exact topic, but that's just some context I want to add to this whole discussion about affordability and availability. Next slide. Okay, and another thing. This whole conversation is why the term affordable housing is so fraught. It's actually a discussion that HousingLink is having internally about how to talk about affordable housing. You know, it's a term that's thrown around, but there's not a lot of set definitions, or there's really no set definition. Local governments say one thing when they're establishing housing goals or developing programs, but obviously individual families looking for housing can only evaluate the idea of affordable relative to their own circumstances. As an example, tax credit properties, which make up a bulk of affordable housing that has a public financing component in it, at least in terms of the new stuff that's being developed. Even these are typically only ensuring rents affordable to 50 or more often 60% of median income. Next slide. And if we recall that affordable by AMI graphic, between 44 and 55% of private market rents are already affordable to families making 60% of the area median. And it's nice, it's really nice to be able to guarantee that the rents will remain affordable for an extended period of time, which is what that's doing. It will, you know, those rents cannot go above that amount, but that level of affordability is not going to touch those folks at the 30% level who, unless they end up in a creative living arrangement, like, you know, doubling up, are generally only able to be assisted through housing with deep subsidies, where they're only paying 30% of their income toward rent, for instance. Now, this is not all to say that all the changes, not to say that all the changes in the rental market don't have some sort of indirect or ripple effects down the line. Next slide. We do see that the percentage of the market that is affordable to those of moderate income, those making 50 or 60% of the area median, goes up when the market softens a bit. And that really hard to serve group of extremely low income folks. Next slide. Well, at least for some of them, we can often see changes in the market reflected in their ability to place housing choice vouchers. So a family with a voucher, commonly called Section 8 vouchers, can use it theoretically in the private market. They rent a place and a large percent of the rent is paid for by the federal government, but there are no federal or state requirements for a landlord to accept the voucher, and most do not, for a variety of reasons that are not the focus of this presentation. But there's a lot of local effort on the part of advocates and housing authorities to encourage and increase the acceptance of vouchers. But historically, those efforts just don't have the amount of power that the market forces do. We typically find that when the market loosens up, just like you might see landlords starting to offer concessions, like first month free or whatever, you also see a larger number of landlords accepting vouchers. Next slide. Here is a landlord acceptance by vouchers, percent of landlords accepting vouchers trend. And I want to put a huge disclaimer on this, that this is not the overall percentage of landlords accepting vouchers in the state. So unlike our rent data, when we give rent trends, that's representative of the entire market, but we don't have voucher acceptance data for all of we only know that about landlords who post on our site. And those tend to be a clientele of people who are a little more mission driven. So you could figure that, if there's like saying 40% of landlords are accepting vouchers here, in actuality is probably closer to something like 20% overall. But this is more about just sort of the direction of the trend. And the other thing, as I should mention, is Minneapolis. And someone from Homeline can step in if I'm wrong here, but I think Minneapolis is the only city in the state currently with a voucher acceptance ordinance. Is that right?
That's correct, Dan, and it was challenged in court, but the key components of it were held. The city more or less won at the Minnesota Supreme Court, but it's still sort of pending. But I think so. You don't include Minneapolis because
that's exactly right. Yeah.
So can I ask you really quick on this?
Yeah.
If a landlord's listing with HousingLink, do they have to answer this question?
They do, yes.
Okay. That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, Minneapolis listing is not part of this data set. And we do see that pretty much like every other measure we were seeing, there's a little bump, or for some measures it was a dip, but right around the end of 2020 that now seems to be ebbing as the overall market tightens again. Next slide. So I've thrown like a ton of detail at you in the last little bit. This is where I bring a lot of this together. So you sort of like read from left to right. On the left is the long-term trend that seemed to be fairly consistent for like nearly a decade. And then we saw something happening in late 2020 or early 2021. And then what seems to be resolving in by quarter two of 2021. So with regard to rents and housing searches and vacancy rate and available listings and voucher acceptance. The pandemic is not yet resolved. Next slide. But, there's the end of renter supports, the end of the eviction moratorium, and that persistently high number of long-term unemployed. I'm using the word uncertainty a lot, but as I had said earlier, there's some hope that there's a lot of people in the system that are still going to be. We know that there are a number of applications that are pending, so that some hope that those get worked through. But there is uncertainty. Next slide. All right, I'm going to cover just one more thing we've been tracking at HousingLink. Just because I had mentioned earlier the balance of multifamily versus shadow market. So the shadow market being like the non-multifamily, so single family, condo, duplex, townhome. This graph comes directly off our Twin Cities rental housing trends dashboard. I just did a copy paste. You see the URL at the bottom of the screen. And you can see the percent of listings that made up multifamily kind of. It has some bumps along the way, but it's mostly hanging out around 80% of the market. We know that in the wake of the foreclosure crisis right after the Great Recession, nearly half the vacancies we encountered were in that single family or other category. So that was people foreclosed homes changing into rental, if temporarily. But since that, a lot of it has gotten absorbed back into ownership stock as housing, housing sales prices have been more attractive to sellers. But as we have said, the shadow market is a really necessary part of the rental housing landscape, just because there's a lot of instances where a rental opportunity there is going to be the only unit that meets a given family's needs. Next slide. So if we look back over a longer period of time, we see a kind of concerning trend from the past couple of years where percentage of the overall market was at 30% for shadow market in 2018 and 2019. And then it dips down to 23% for 2020. And this year it was down to 18%. So that is a bit concerning. I do think that there is the chance that there are some very pandemic specific factors at play that could be making this a temporary phenomenon, that this isn't sort of the final resting place for this balance. I think the last year has been a really scary time for renters and landlords, and a lot of landlords aren't really testing the market unless they have to. How I mentioned a lot of rental vacancies we pick up are from multifamily construction. So there's not generally new single family rental construction, right? The only way most shadow market rentals enter the market is if somebody decides to convert a previously owned unit into a rental. Obviously you're getting unit vacancies if a unit turns over, but where new housing development can put new units in on the apartment side, that's not happening in the rental side. And so you're counting for single family rental vacancies. You're really counting on units turning over. But new units are only coming in that market if somebody decides to take like a previously owned home and turn it into a rental. And I just don't think that a lot of landlords are making that choice. They hear about the rental assistance and the eviction moratorium and so on. And so I think as there is a little more stability or perceived stability in the rental market, I think that would probably encourage some potential shadow market landlords to enter the market and kind of bolster that segment a little bit. That's the hope anyway. Next slide. And that is pretty much everything I have prepared for you today. You see a drop down here from our research navigation header on our website where you can see a lot of the resources I was talking about. It's actually a screenshot from our What's New in HousingLink research page. And we try to keep that updated with our latest stuff we've come out with. So you can visit here and cruise around, or you can also sign up to get announcements of new stuff coming out. And yeah, that's all I got. On the last slide, I just have my email. If anyone go to that, if anyone has questions about anything today, or if you want to, partner on some mini Minnesota housing research project with me, let me know.
Well, excellent. Thank you, Dan. This has been very informative and interesting. That last you covered so much. I was trying to take notes on questions I had, but that last thing that you covered, the shadow market, I think anecdotally is something that we're seeing as well, just from our clients' perspective. So
good. As I said, it's really nice when you can sort of triangulate a couple corroborating findings, so you feel a little bit better that there's something. You don't feel better if it's a discouraging trend, but at least more confident in what you're asserting.
And Millicent is asking again, can you explain what the shadow market is in the context of your research?
Yep, shadow market. And I think that there's another, maybe we launched into this a decade ago and we should have chosen another term, but it's what we really went full on with. But shadow market referring to anything that's like not multifamily. So shadow market being single family, condo, duplex, townhome, just not sort of a larger property owned by a management company.
So often that might be smaller time landlords, but not necessarily.
Right. Yeah. There can be, the threat of single families owned by large, out of state entities, those would still be captured in our data as shadow market.
All right. Well, and then, yeah, the voucher data I thought was really fascinating, and just over the interesting comparing it to previous years too, but before 2020 as well. Because yeah, I remember when you came, I think you came on in September. It might have been like the week that the federal CDC moratorium it started, which didn't have too much of a drastic impact here in Minnesota, but yeah, it just goes to show that there were, and you did a great job of going through just the multiple interventions that have happened, and yet we're still in flux, and I think it just goes to the fact that we have one of these. We've had one of these almost every week since last April. Not every week, but I've done close to 70 of them, and we continue to get some of the same questions, or just having to reframe answers based on continually changing questions. So appreciate your overview. I am seeing maybe one question. Paul is saying, thanks, excellent and informative.
Well, thank you.
And here, let's maybe ask you this one. An anonymous question. It seems that the market is especially difficult for hard to house tenants these days. Defining that term as somebody who might have prior evictions, criminal history, poor credit, inconsistent income. What suggestions do you have for tenants in this situation seeking to find housing?
So we actually have a program through HousingLink called Beyond Backgrounds. So if you're like if you work with clients, and I apologize, I'm not the person that's working directly with that program, so I don't know all the criteria for qualifying, but we're working with a number of organizations who sort of work under this umbrella Beyond Background. So it's like landlords that have specifically opted into being willing to work with hard to house tenants in exchange for they get a risk pool for funding. So like if something goes wrong, they can access the risk fund. And we've had really good success with the program. I don't think, I think there's some geographies that don't qualify, and you need to look into like how to get into that. But that's one thing I would say to check out first is Beyond Backgrounds on the HousingLink website, which is housinglink.org. In general, other than that, it's just, I know we used to work the Project Homeless Connect, like have a live booth, and we would get people, with some of the most difficult rental history, and they talking about backgrounds. And we do say, and that's kind of goes back to that shadow market that, we encourage people to, you're probably going to have better luck if you're working in the shadow market, where you're not going to get screened out by a faceless entity, and you could be more likely to have an actual conversation with a person where you can actually explain to them, this is the difficulty. I acknowledge the difficulty I have in my background, and this is why it's not going to be a problem. And we actually have some training videos and informational stuff on our website you may or may not know about, depending on how familiar you are with HousingLink, but we actually have done trainings on hard to house tenants. And so I would encourage you to click around there, but that's what I can think of off the top of my head. All
right. Well, thank you, Dan. I shared in the chat the link to the Beyond Backgrounds. I know another response to this question is just, well, maybe it's not specific to tenants that are in that situation. We'd encourage folks to call us if you have some need for legal advice in this area. I do know Homeland was a part of a study in 2019 through 2020, just looking at the practice of tenant screening and selection. And I'll put that link in the chat as well, just some of the issues that comes up, because we get these questions a lot, and there's a lot of factors at play there. Okay, well, we have 10 minutes. Please, if you do have a question for Dan, send it in. Dan, is it all right if we share your slides along with the recording on our website? Totally fine, yeah. I'm gonna give a little thumbs up on that excellent and informative comment, if that's all right. So we'll do that. We'll share that. Somebody is asking if we're planning to apply for CLE credit. We did not plan to do that for today's session, but we will send out a link, and a link to the recordings will be available on our website later as well. So with not seeing more questions, is it all right if I transition to asking some legal questions to Rachel?
I mean, fine by me.
Thanks again, Dan. If you want to stick around for 9 minutes to see if there's more questions, you're welcome to, but feel no need to if you have to run. Again, thank you for your presentation.
You're welcome. I'll hang around for a few minutes.
All right.
Thank you.
All right, Rachel. Here's some that got submitted in advance. If
Okay.
Janet, I think, is a landlord. If a renter has applied for rent help MN assistance, can the landlord continue accepting rent payment? Does that waive the right to evict?
So that's slightly more complicated at the moment. So if someone has a pending rent help MN application, they apply for specific months, right? And they're allowed at this point up to 15 months of assistance with no monetary cap. But so, and they can apply for up to 3 months of forward assistance if they're also behind. So what happens, I know there's some applications who've done that and they're about to run out of their the 3 months that they initially applied for. So, or say that they didn't apply for the forward assistance, but they applied for back assistance. A landlord can accept rent if a tenant is able to pay for going forward. They just weren't able to pay for some of the back stuff. A landlord is able to accept rent. At this point, the ability to evict for non-payment because of a pending application continues through June of 2022. So say that a tenant has a pending application, the application technically is only for, I'll say, March through August of this year. But that's pending, and it's going to be pending for a while yet. They fall behind on rent for December of this next year. They still have a pending application because so long as the application hasn't been completed, not completed, it has to be completed to be pending. But so long as the pending application exists, the landlord and the tenant can add more months on until that 15-month cap is reached. So I don't know that the waiving the right to evict is the right way to think about it necessarily. It's the law doesn't allow someone to evict for non-payment of rent while that pending application is happening. And so regardless of whether that pending application is for the past and the tenant fails to pay rent in the future, so long as the pending application is there, that protection is in place.
And in addition to this, in the rent help MN program guide, it specifically states there's a prohibition for evicting a tenant for non-payment of rent for any period covered by the rental assistance through the program.
That's a good point. So if you have 3 months of forward rent that goes through December of this year, you can't evict them for non-payment of rent from December because you've already gotten paid for it.
All right, so I'll throw a link in the chat to where you can download the program guide, because a lot of the questions sometimes can get answered just by what's in the program guide, but it is lengthy. So, all right, next question. Alyssa is asking, what is Homeline's role when a tenant calls in with a landlord problem, such as a wrongful eviction? And I think Alyssa's a service provider. Just a quick overview about what Homeline is. Our contact information is on the screen there. We advise any renter in the state of Minnesota about their tenant landlord rental situation. It's free and confidential and in multiple languages, English, Spanish, Somali, and Hmong. We do advice and referrals and document review and referrals to form letters or suggestions for form letters or form responses to landlord to a situation. But yes, we give advice and information over the phone primarily and via email. We don't do representation. We will. So the question was about eviction, a wrongful eviction. If a renter calls us, we are going to advise them about their situation as much as we can with the information they provide us. If they're facing a what appears to be a wrongful eviction, we're going to give them the information to hopefully be able to defend themselves if they're able to show up in court, which is kind of the key thing, is getting to court. And we may also, depending on their location and their income level, suggest a legal aid office or other provider like Volunteer Lawyers Network who might be able to provide representation, because in certain communities, particularly in Hennepin and Ramsey right now, there are the number of evictions are at a number that our understanding is a lot of legal aid offices are able to represent folks if they income qualify. So that was probably a longer answer than you needed, but that's the answer. Okay, let's jump to Jessica's question. Is there a contact that landlords can call or email for questions?
So this, I saw that one and we were talking about, it's a little unsure of what you mean by for what purpose to contact. So like if it's Rent Help MN questions, there is a specific email that Rent Help MN uses for landlords. It's landlords@renthelpmn.org. That's what we've been told is the best option for landlords to communicate with questions to the Rent Help MN program. If it's just standard legal questions, we're not able to assist those, obviously, but there are some programs out there that do. So the Legal Corps is a program that can help some low-income landlords if they've got questions. I know Volunteer Lawyers Network can sometimes offer assistance if it's an owner-occupied rental unit. So there are some options out there, but yeah, otherwise, if it's a situation where it's not necessarily where you don't meet the income requirements for like VLN or Legal Corps, usually we direct folks to the Minnesota Bar Association to see if there's a private attorney. They have a find a lawyer option. That's a good place to start trying to track down an attorney that might be able to assist you with your circumstances if you're a landlord.
And again, this answers both of the last questions. Homeline does not, we provide general information on these seminars. We do trainings for landlords, but conflict of interest issue if we were to advise landlords. Okay, so then we're going to, we got a handful more here and we're just hitting 3. So we'll tackle these. Emily asked, and I think this question came up when you were going through the calendar or the timeline. So Emily asked, what happens if a tenant has a pending application and their lease ends?
So this gets, it's a different answer almost every week, right now. But essentially, at the moment, if a lease ended, say on the end of September, what would happen now is that at the moment, you cannot just terminate a lease because you don't want to renew it. So that would, unless another agreement is reached between the landlord and the tenant, what happens is that it just becomes a month-to-month lease, essentially. So the same lease terms are going to just renew on a month-to-month basis until some sort of notice is given. And that option to give notice is going to become an option starting next week. So that's when those restrictions on non-renewals and lease terminations essentially lift. And so if a tenant has a pending application, up until now, what we've been telling folks, because this has been Minnesota Housing's view on the guidance that's been issued up to now, is that if a tenant is no longer living at the residence that they are applying for help at, then they will not pay. We got notification today, it looks like it's up on MHSA's website, that that is changing starting next week on the 15th. Tenants can start applying for rental assistance for rent arrears for previous addresses that they were living at. Not all the details are out yet, but I do know that it's supposed to start being effective next week on the 15th. So that we'll go more into detail with that next week when we have Max on, and about we'll try and get more into information as we get some clarification. Again, that information just came out today about like an effective date and things like that. So that, Emily, the answer to your question is changing potentially rather rapidly. But if after the 12th, if a lease is just ending on and you don't come to a new agreement, then then after the 12th, you can give appropriate notice that you don't want the lease to renew. Depending on the notice requirements in the lease, if it's a one rental period notice requirement, then you could give that notice on October 12th, and the tenant would feasibly have to be out probably by the 30th if your rental period is from starting on the 1st. If it's a 60-day rental period, or excuse me, 60-day notice requirement, then you have to give the 60-day notice on the 12th. So that's when the notices are valid to be given. Anything that's given before then, we've seen some folks who are, gotten notice in September that they had to be out by October or at the end of October. And at the time that those notices were given, they weren't valid because you weren't allowed to not renew a lease under the session law. So that is effectively not renewing a lease. So that's October 12th is when you can start saying that you're not renewing a lease for legal reasons.
And you answered a couple of questions there. That was helpful. There's a related question from anonymous attendee that I think is sort of down the same avenue, but maybe we'll just cover it again. But so again, clarifying whether a pending application provides protection from other evictions. If the lease is expired, can the landlord give notice? There was something mentioned in the previous webinar that seemed to suggest that the protection was more broad than non-payment grounds. Some tenants have applied for assistance even though the threat of eviction was unrelated to payment. So I think what was mentioned last week was that it depends on what the filing is for, and how the grounds, the allegations in the filing, and how a court is going to respond to that. There might be a situation where a tenant is behind and has been notified that they're behind multiple occasions, and they're seeking rental assistance to assert their rights under their lease. And so they might be protected under other Minnesota laws related to retaliation if there was a choice made to terminate the lease early. So that's I'm not sure if there's much to be clarified about that, other than that is feasibly a situation that a renter and a landlord might be in. The phase out law that goes until June of next year states evictions for non-payment cannot be filed for someone with a pending application. Does not, the phase out law does not impact the other rights that a tenant, rights or responsibilities a tenant or landlord might have in around lease termination or non-renewal.
Yep.
That was a word salad, but did I get it across? Okay.
Yeah, I think so. Basically, the restrictions that have been in place have been, that's the whole point of the phase out, is that they're slowly being lifted. And so regardless of pending application status, certain eviction options just haven't been available, such as like holding over. That just isn't available right now. But starting in, those restrictions essentially lift on the 12th. And the only protections that remain are for non-payment of rent evictions, and only if a tenant has a pending application with one of those COVID-19 emergency rental assistance programs.
All right, one more question here. I'm not sure if we can answer this or not, but we'll try to. Again, what I'll say just very quickly before we have this last question is up on your screen is the webinar schedule. Next week, we are going to be talking in more detail about the October 12th change, and then we're going to have Housing Stability Attorney Max Tsai from the Housing Justice Center on to talk a little bit about the work that they're doing with issues, appeals, concerns that tenants might have with the Rent Help MN application process. And since there's this news that Rachel just mentioned about some changes to Rent Help MN's policy guide on some of these issues, we'll hopefully be able to answer some questions about this, get into the details more. But this question from an anonymous attendee, I had a tenant tell me today that she called Zero Balance Project today, was told because she had previously received rent assistance from Rent Help MN, she'd need to reapply with them and not Zero Balance Project. Do we know if that's true? They also told her that once she uses 15 months from Rent Help MN, then she can apply for assistance with Zero Balance. I didn't think this was the case because the funds are coming from the same source. Is this correct?
Can I step in on this one, actually?
Sure.
Yeah, Dan stuck
Please.
around. Thank you.
I
don't
have some
ab-
ideas,
Yeah.
but
Oh, I was gonna say, I don't absolutely know the answer, but HousingLink is actually administering Zero
Mhm.
Balance. Like we're doing a lot of the administrative stuff on it. So we have a bunch of experts on staff. So if this anonymous attendee would like to send me an email, I will connect them with somebody that can hopefully get back to them directly on this. If that would be useful.
that'd be great. Because my
Okay.
only thought is that I know that the Zero Balance Project is a landlord initiated application. And so I don't know that a tenant could apply directly to Zero Balance.
Right, yeah, they're just
Regardless.
supposed to get sort of the cue from the landlords, like, I got this started for you, and then I think the renter has to supply some, you know, is asked to sort of pitch in their part, but yeah, there's my email address again, so if you want to send me a note, I'll send this on to a couple of our experts that are answering these sorts of questions all day.
Thank you, Dan. And
Yeah, thank you.
we've had some of those experts on, and we're going to have some experts from Rent Help MN and Zero Balance on again in November. There's the rest of the webinar schedule. So we're not always the experts on the rental assistance programs, but we try to bring people in that can help answer questions on it. So that's again why we have Max on next week. Again, on the 27th of October, so we're skipping a couple of weeks or a week there. We are working to schedule a couple of speakers in Minneapolis and St. Paul to speak about the rent control or rent stabilization measures that are on the ballots in those two cities. And then we'll be scheduling dates in November with some folks from Rent Help MN, Zero Balance, and some other topics as well. So, so I guess that's everything for today. We're almost 10 minutes over, but want to thank Rachel again for the presentation and answering the Q&A. And Dan, as always, really appreciate your insightful research and analysis on the rental market trends. So I don't know if we're going to be still doing these a year from now, but if you're around, we might we might ask you to join again, just because the 1 year over the next has been pretty fascinating.
Maybe we'll be able to call it the post-pandemic check-in. Let's hope.
And maybe we can do it in person.
Ooh.
All right. Well, thank you again, Dan, and thanks for folks joining us. And we will maybe see you next week.
Thanks.
Bye. Bye.
Thanks all.